There are sounds that history refuses to forget. Scratching, gnawing, the desperate scraping of claws against metal, against skin, in the darkest chambers of medieval Europe where morality dissolved into shadow, torturers discovered something more terrible than any blade. They discovered that nature itself could become a weapon. And all it required was hunger. This is the story of the rat torture, a punishment so psychologically devastating, so viscerally horrifying that even hardened executioners struggled to watch. But to understand why this method existed, why it was chosen, why it haunted the nightmares of entire populations, we must first understand the world that created it. Medieval Europe was not the romanticized realm of knights and castles we imagine today. It was a landscape soaked in blood, where justice and vengeance walked hand in hand down cobblestone streets. Public executions were entertainment, torture was policy. And pain was currency in a world where power demanded absolute submission. The rat torture emerged during a period historians call the Age of Spectacular Punishment. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't even primarily about information extraction. It was about theater. It was about creating such visceral horror that witnesses would carry the memory like a scar and never dare to challenge authority again. But why rats? To answer that, we need to understand medieval psychology. In an era before germ theory, before medicine as we know it, rats were already creatures of profound terror. They carried the plague. They infested homes. They gnawed through walls, through food stores, through the corpses left in the streets during outbreaks. Rats were symbols of death itself. Silent, unstoppable, multiplying in darkness. The torturers understood this primal fear, and they weaponized it. The method itself varied across regions and time periods, but the core principle remained consistent. A cage or metal bucket would be filled with live rats, typically 2 to 4, though some accounts mention more. This container would then be placed against the victim's body, most commonly the abdomen or chest. The open end would be pressed firmly against bare skin, creating a sealed chamber with only one direction for the rats to go: down, into flesh. But rats don't naturally burrow into living tissue. They're opportunistic feeders, yes, but they avoid confrontation with creatures larger than themselves. So the torturers needed a catalyst. They needed to transform fear into frenzy, and they found it in heat. A metal plate would be placed on top of the cage. Then burning coals would be piled on the plate. The temperature inside the cage would begin to rise, slowly at first. The rats would grow agitated, pacing, scratching at the metal walls, but metal doesn't give, metal doesn't open. There's only one surface in that cage that isn't burning metal. Only one possible escape route: living flesh. As the heat intensified, as the air inside became unbearable, as the rats' survival instincts overwhelmed all other impulses, they would begin to dig. Historical accounts describe the sound as the worst part. Not the screaming, though victims screamed until their voices shattered, but the sound underneath. The wet, tearing sound of rodent claws and teeth working through skin, through muscle, through abdominal wall. The sound of creatures so desperate to escape heat that they would tunnel through a human body to find coolness on the other side. The process could take hours. Rats don't have the tools for quick excavation through flesh. They work slowly, frantically, their small bodies pressed together in the confined space, all clawing at the same general area. Victims would feel every movement, every scratch, every bite. They would feel the rats' bodies pushing deeper, writhing against organs, seeking any pathway that might lead away from the unbearable heat above. Some historical texts claim that in extreme cases, rats would actually emerge from the victim's back. Whether this is medical fact or medieval exaggeration remains debated among historians. What isn't debated is the psychological devastation. Victims who survived, and some did, depending on when the torture was stopped, were never the same. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was existential. But we must pause here and ask the question that haunts all dark history. Who used this, and more disturbingly, on whom? The rat torture appears most prominently in records from the Dutch Revolt of the 16th century. Spanish Inquisition documents reference similar methods, though descriptions are often vague, hidden behind euphemistic language. The practice spread across Europe, finding particular favor in regions where religious and political persecution intensified. The victims were heretics, political dissidents, accused witches, people who questioned authority, people who loved the wrong person. People who simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. In an era where a whispered accusation could become a death sentence, the rat torture served as the ultimate deterrent. Communities would hear what happened in those torture chambers. They would imagine, and imagination. Imagination was sometimes worse than reality. There's a particular account from the Dutch city of Haarlem in 1573. A Protestant prisoner, whose name has been lost to history, was subjected to the rat torture for refusing to convert to Catholicism. The session lasted, according to witnesses, nearly 6 hours. When it finally ended, the man was still alive. Barely. He was carried back to his cell where he died 3 days later from infection and blood loss. But in those 3 days, he never stopped whispering the same words. "They're still inside, they're still inside." He was delirious. The rats had been removed, but his mind couldn't accept that the torture had ended. This psychological shattering is what the method was designed to achieve. Physical pain ends, but the memory of rats eating through your stomach, that memory becomes a prison that lasts forever. We must also examine the torturers themselves. Who were these people? How does a human being develop the capacity to perform such acts? Medieval torture wasn't amateur work, it was a profession. Torturers were often paid well, trained extensively, and held strange positions in society, simultaneously feared and necessary. They lived in designated houses, often on the outskirts of towns. Their families bore the stigma of their profession for generations. In some regions, torture was a hereditary occupation, passed from father to son like a cursed inheritance. The psychological mechanisms that allowed these individuals to perform their duties are the same we see in any system of institutional violence. Dehumanization of victims, bureaucratic distance, religious or ideological justification. The torturer wasn't committing evil, he was serving justice. He was protecting society. He was doing God's work. The cognitive dissonance required for such beliefs is staggering. But history shows us, again and again, that humans are capable of believing anything if the alternative is confronting their own monstrosity. There are accounts of torturers who became alcoholics, who developed severe psychological disorders, who in their final years sought absolution from priests, confessing nightmares that never ended. One recorded confession from a German executioner in 1611 describes dreams where he's in the cage instead of the rats, where it's his teeth tearing flesh, his claws scratching through organs. He writes that he couldn't remember anymore who was the animal, the rat, or himself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the rat torture isn't its physical horror. It's how effectively it worked, how efficiently it broke people, how completely it destroyed not just the body but the will itself. Victims would confess to anything, would betray anyone, would renounce beliefs held sacred for entire lifetimes. The rat torture had an almost perfect success rate in extracting confessions, which tells us something terrible about human nature. We like to believe we'd resist. We romanticize martyrdom, imagine ourselves standing firm against oppression, but when faced with the reality of rats chewing through our stomach wall, most people broke quickly, completely. This raises profound questions about the nature of confession under torture. Every legal system in the medieval period relied heavily on confession as the highest form of proof, but if you can make someone confess to anything through sufficient pain, what is that confession worth? The answer, of course, is nothing. But medieval justice wasn't concerned with truth. It was concerned with order, with spectacle, with maintaining the fiction of divine authority. The rat torture also reveals something about how humans innovate in cruelty. It wasn't enough to have execution, wasn't enough to have quick death. There was a perceived need to create methods that maximized psychological devastation. That transformed dying into something so horrible that witnesses would be traumatized into obedience. This is the banality of evil that historian Hannah Arendt would later describe. Not monsters performing monstrous acts, but ordinary people within systems of power making rational decisions that lead to unimaginable horror. The rat torture was developed logically. It was refined through experimentation. It was documented in official manuals that described the optimal number of rats, the ideal temperature of coals, the most effective placement of the cage. There's a particular manual from the Spanish Inquisition, dated 1567, that describes the rat torture with the clinical detachment of a cooking recipe. Place the vessel firmly against the abdomen. Ensure no gaps exist where the creatures might escape. Apply heat gradually to maximize the duration of enhanced questioning. Enhanced questioning, that's what they called it, as if language could sanitize the unspeakable. By the mid-17th century, something began to shift. The Age of Enlightenment was approaching. Philosophers started questioning the foundations of justice. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria wrote treatises arguing that torture was not only morally wrong but pragmatically useless, that confessions extracted through pain were inherently unreliable. Legal reforms slowly began eliminating judicial torture from European law, but the rat torture didn't disappear. It went underground. It became an unofficial method, used in secret, documented less openly. There are accounts from 19th century colonial prisons of similar techniques being employed. Even into the 20th century, during various conflicts and regimes, variations of the rat torture have appeared. The Chinese Civil War, the Dirty War in Argentina. Reports from modern conflicts that I cannot verify but cannot dismiss. This persistence suggests something deeply troubling, that the rat torture in all its visceral horror taps into something fundamental about human cruelty, about our capacity to transform nature into nightmare, about our willingness to inflict suffering when we convince ourselves it serves a greater purpose. There's a philosophical question buried in this history. What separates the torturer from the tortured? Circumstance, ideology, the accident of birth. In different times, different places, any of us could have been in either position. The prisoner screaming in the chamber, or the guard heating the coals. This proximity to evil, this recognition that we're all capable of becoming monsters given the right conditions. It's perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. We must also consider the legacy of such practices. How do societies recover from generations of normalized brutality? How does collective trauma heal when the wounds are inflicted by the state itself, by systems of justice that became systems of terror? Medieval Europe never really confronted this history. There was no Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the torture chambers, no memorial for the thousands who died in unimaginable agony. History simply moved on. The torture rooms were sealed, the equipment was destroyed or lost. The records were archived and forgotten, and society pretended it had always been civilized. But forgetting isn't healing. And the psychological scars of institutional violence persist across generations, encoded in cultural memory, shaping how communities relate to authority, how they process trauma, how they understand justice itself. The rat torture also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. We like to believe that civilization represents progress, that we've evolved beyond such barbarism. But have we? Or have we simply developed more sophisticated methods of inflicting suffering, more bureaucratic systems of oppression, more sanitized language to describe the unspeakable, Modern torture often avoids physical marks. It's psychological now: sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, isolation techniques that break the mind without breaking the body. We've made torture invisible, but that doesn't make it less real. In some ways, it makes it more insidious. At least medieval torture was honest about its brutality. There's also the question of memory. How do we remember such history? Do we study it clinically, treating it as academic curiosity? Do we look away, dismissing it as too disturbing to contemplate? Or do we sit with the discomfort, allowing ourselves to fully comprehend what humans are capable of doing to each other? I believe we must do the latter, not because it's pleasant, not because it makes us feel good about ourselves, but because forgetting is dangerous. Because the same ideologies that justified the rat torture, the belief that enemies are less than human, that the ends justify the means, that authority must be maintained at any cost, these ideologies persist. They find new forms, new justifications, new victims. The rats themselves are innocent in this history. They were tools transformed by human cruelty into instruments of torture. In nature, rats are intelligent, social animals. They care for their sick, they play, they form complex communities, but in that heated cage pressed against human flesh, they became monsters because we made them monsters. We created the conditions that transformed survival instinct into horror. This is what the rat torture ultimately represents, not just medieval cruelty, but the human capacity to corrupt everything we touch when we're driven by fear, hatred, and the hunger for power. We took animals and made them weapons. We took justice and made it vengeance. We took authority and made it tyranny. The torture chambers are empty now, the equipment has crumbled to rust. The torturers are long dead, but the echo remains in every system that prioritizes order over humanity, in every justification for cruelty. In every moment when we look away from suffering because acknowledging it would be uncomfortable. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember, what we choose to learn, what we choose to carry forward. The rat torture demands that we remember the worst of what we're capable of, so that we might possibly choose to be better. There are still screams in those empty chambers, still scratching in the silence. Still the weight of thousands of souls who died in darkness, their suffering weaponized to terrify generations into submission. We cannot bring them back, cannot undo their agony, but we can bear witness. We can refuse to let their suffering be meaningless. Some truths are too heavy to carry, too dark to fully comprehend. The rat torture is one of those truths. It sits at the intersection of human ingenuity and human depravity, a monument to our capacity for calculated cruelty. It reminds us that evil isn't always monstrous. Sometimes it's methodical. Sometimes it's documented in official manuals. Sometimes it's performed by ordinary people who convince themselves they're just doing their job. The medieval world that created this horror is gone, but the psychological structures that enabled it, the willingness to dehumanize, the capacity to justify suffering, the systems that transform cruelty into policy, these persist. They adapt. They find new forms, and so the study of historical horror becomes not just academic, but urgent, not just interesting, but essential, because the question isn't whether such things happened. They did. The question is whether we've learned anything, whether we've truly evolved. Whether, when faced with the choice between humanity and expedience, between compassion and control, between recognizing the sacred dignity of every person or reducing them to obstacles to be eliminated, whether we'll choose differently. The rats are still there, in a sense. Still waiting in cages we've built ourselves. Still ready to be weaponized by anyone willing to apply enough heat, enough pressure, enough fear. The method changes, the technology advances, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Power seeking to maintain itself through spectacular brutality, suffering used as currency, pain transformed into policy. We stand now, centuries removed from those torture chambers, looking back through the fog of history. We shake our heads, we say never again. We comfort ourselves with the distance, but distance is an illusion. The capacity for such cruelty lies in every human heart, waiting for the right conditions, the right justifications, the right authorities to activate it. This is the final lesson of the rat torture, not that medieval people were monsters, but that monstrosity is a choice we make again and again whenever we allow systems of power to override empathy, whenever we accept that some suffering is necessary, whenever we look away because witnessing would require us to act. The chambers are empty, but the choice remains in every generation. In every society, in every human heart, will we heat the coals or will we finally break the cage history remembers? Even when we wish it wouldn't, some echoes never fade. They wait in the archives, in the spaces between what's written and what's whispered. The rats are gone, but the scratching remains.